Good afternoon or morning, depending on the time zone that you're dialing in from. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Megan Shamus. I run marketing for the FIDO Alliance. We're looking forward to today's webinar where we will be discussing the FIDO Fit for PSD2 compliance, specifically how FIDO compares to some of the legacy authentication methods you may be using or considering for strong customer authentication. We recently published a white paper on this topic, which I would urge you to read. We'll be sharing the URL for that later on in the webinar. Before we get started, let me just run through a few housekeeping notes. So you'll notice that you're in listen-only mode, but you can ask questions at any time using the GoToWebinar client. We will have Q&A later on in the webinar, so please do ask your questions as they arise, and we will try to address all of that at the end. We are recording the webinar, and the recording and these slides will be emailed to you and also posted on our website. And then lastly, please stay on at the end and take the survey. This is really helpful for us to learn and inform some of our webinar program and how we can best serve you. Let me introduce today's speakers. We have Alan Martin, who is the head of consulting and industry relations at Thales. He is also the co-chair of our FIDO Europe Working Group, which aims to educate and accelerate FIDO adoption in Europe. And we have Andrew Shikiar, FIDO's Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer, who will be providing some level setting info on FIDO Alliance and FIDO technology. This is our agenda for today. Andrew will be providing an introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Alan, who will discuss PSD2 and how existing solutions for strong customer authentication and why you might consider a change to FIDO. We'll finish off with some Q&A. So as I said before, please do use the webinar client to ask your questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew Shikiar to start off with the intro to FIDO.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks everybody for joining today. As those of you who have been on multiple FIDO webinars know, PSD2 is an area of great interest to FIDO Alliance and its members, and we do believe that our specifications have a strong foundation for enabling businesses to meet PSD2 requirements by implementing FIDO authentication. So, as Megan said, I'm going to give you a little background for some of those of you who are newer to FIDO. I'm going to quickly give some background on the Alliance and our approach to authentication to set the stage for Alan's conversation in a few minutes. So let's first look at the problem statement that FIDO is looking to address. And ultimately, FIDO was formed to address the data breach plague, and user authentication is at the tip of that spear. As we know, has been well documented, the vast majority of data breaches are caused by passwords. Passwords present usability challenges. They inherently are insecure, and in general, our traditional approach to authentication has led to all sorts of problems, such as those you see here. You see, and by the way, we could have dozens of slides like this with all sorts of, compelling and scary statistics. But you see some things that pop out at me on this slide are the growth in credential loss. One challenge that's out there in the marketplace is credential stuffing, the credential stuffing cycle, where stolen credentials from a data breach make their way onto the dark web. They're reused, resold, successfully stuffed into e-commerce sites and other valuable sites. You can see both the top line and bottom line threats to businesses in both the cost associated with trying to prevent fraud, as well as the lost revenue through the inconvenience of logins. And also we have some data in here about the current situation that we all find ourselves in with COVID-19. With everyone working remotely, the threats and the opportunity has grown for hackers and bad actors, and the imperative for stronger authentication for consumers and employees alike continues to grow. So this is the landscape FIDO inherited, and this is the challenge that we're seeking to address. More specifically, let's compare FIDO to traditional means of authentication. So first we look at passwords, right? So we all understand as individuals, as consumers, we understand the usability challenges of passwords. So it's either going to be So simple that it's easy to hack, or you're going to reuse it, which is, we all know not to do, but many still do. Or it's so complex it's hard to remember, let alone try to enter into a keyboardless device, or, God forbid, a smart TV. So the usability challenges are huge. Security is inherently incredibly weak. There are other means of second factor authentication, and we'll talk about some of those today in the context of FCA requirements. But across the board, traditionally, before FIDO was on the scene, people would use OTPs or token-based, strong second factor authentication. And to be clear, any form of MFA will address, over 95% of scalable phishing and credential attacks. But the fact of the matter is, this approach still has some weaknesses and vulnerabilities. From a weakness standpoint, usability is worse, frankly. So if you have a dedicated token, traditionally these tokens were dedicated to one service, so you could have a token keychain problem. There's also the requirement of physical token to input, be juggling two devices to put in data. SMS OTP certainly is more pervasive, also has usability, deliverability challenges. But perhaps most important to understand is that from a security standpoint, these are still one-time passcodes, and it's still a password sitting on a server that can and will be manipulated through either SS7 attacks or man-in-the-middle and relay attacks. It's still vulnerable and phishable. So that's where FIDO's really steps in. Our goal is to blend the best of both worlds by having something that's highly usable and highly secure. And that's what FIDO focuses on. We create open standards for simpler, stronger authentication. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do is move the market away from depending on server-side shared secrets to a world where it's a little bit more decentralized in nature, where users authenticate locally to the device that's likely in their hands already, using asymmetric public key cryptography, which admittedly is a mouthful, but the beauty of it is that the simplicity of FIDO is that you're using a single gesture, whether you're inserting a security key or touching a biometric. Simple enough for the user doesn't have to think about the unphishable technology that sits underneath. So Alan will go in a little bit more detail about how FIDO works, and also we have plenty of resources on our website for those of you who want to dig deeper in the technology and who are not yet familiar. So in summary, what FIDO does, we're breaking the credential theft cycle, we're preventing account takeovers, again, by moving away from server-side shared secrets. There's no longer anything of value for hackers to steal from the server. If you buy credentials off the dark web, they won't work, and it really starts to change the playing field by stopping this supply and demand for user credentials for hackers. So a little bit about who FIDO is. That's our goal. This here is FIDO's board of directors. We have 40 companies on the board and 250 organizations in FIDO Alliance overall. I'd say generally our members fall into one of three categories, which is represented by the board also. We have companies who create the devices and platforms that we use every day. So companies like Apple, Google, and Microsoft, and Samsung, the chipset providers. We have specialists in identity and security. So long-time experts in this, like Thales and many other companies. And last but not least, we have the service providers whose businesses are dependent upon their ability to deliver secure services and commerce to billions of consumers worldwide. So these include the payment networks, the banks, e-commerce providers, social media providers. They bring many of the requirements into FIDO Alliance, and then the vendor community works with them to implement these into specifications. So in addition to the board, we have, the board kind of sets the strategy for FIDO. We have sponsor members who build out the specifications and our outputs, associate members who largely comprise the B2B ecosystem of the hundreds of products we have that are FIDO certified. And last but not least, we work with liaison partners who to help identify and educate people on use cases in vertical and regional markets. So one thing that's happened over the past couple of years, and at great scale, is that FIDO is really reaching the platform. And so last year in 2019, both Android and Windows became FIDO certified platforms, by both of these supporting the FIDO2 specification in the operating systems. What this means is that you can now use a biometric on any of these devices. So Windows Hello is a biometric authentication system. Every Android 7 or later device supports biometric authentication. You can use a biometric in either of these devices to authenticate instead of using your password. All right, so this allows users to take the password out of the user login flow entirely with billions of devices here. Additionally, we've seen great support in browsers for FIDO and the Web Authentication Protocol, which is part of the FIDO2 specification as well. So since May of 2018, when the Web Authn was finalized, we've seen support in leading browsers, Edge, Safari, Firefox, Chrome, all have robust support now for FIDO authentication. What this means is that for the merchants out there, the service providers out there, there's now billions of devices that can support FIDO authentication. So if your question was, well, who can actually consume FIDO authentication? If this sounds great, but can I reach a mass audience? The answer is yes. All right, so over 85% of browsers that are active in market actually support FIDO authentication. There's means to deploy native apps across any platform, any device platform, so both iOS and Android. Key message here is that you can reach your customers with FIDO authentication. So with that, I'm very pleased to hand over to Alan to talk about why it changed to FIDO and comparing FIDO to legacy authentication methods. Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. And let's dive in. So, as you all know, PSD2 in Europe introduces a mandate for strong customer authentication. And this mandate introduces challenges. Here you see the way people authenticate before PSD2 in a relatively simple user journey where the user authenticates with their bank, traditionally entering a login and a password, and sometimes using a device to strengthen the authentication process. And so the interactions were relatively easy. However, now with PSD2, as you know, PSD2 introduces new roles of third-party providers, or TPPs, which are regulated roles that can provide services, whether for account aggregation or for payment initiation, and have a right to access to the bank account via open APIs. And so suddenly, the user journey can become far more complex, as the user may start the user journey on the TPP user interface, and at some point will be redirected to a bank user interface in order to authenticate. And by the way, we'll have to use a device necessarily, because strong customer authentication means having a device that materializes the possession factor, as you know. And so the interactions can become complicated, and we will see that actually in a few examples afterwards. So clearly, I think the key message that we all agree upon is that the customer journey will be the key success factor for the rollout of PSD2 in Europe. It's so evident that there have been many debates in Europe between the different stakeholders on this subject. A lot of complaints about risks of a poor user journey, and some notions that have gone into regulation, like the notion of obstacles and so on. Recently, the EBA issued, the European Banking Authority, issued a new opinion in June, reiterating that the authentication with the bank, the ASPSP, should not create unnecessary friction. So it's really a key point. So, as Andrew said, we're going to look here at various strong customer authentication methods, a few of them, not all of them. It doesn't pretend to be an exhaustive exercise, but a few of them, and then we will compare them with FIDO and hopefully convince you that FIDO does make sense actually in the context of PSD2. So we'll start with a very commonly used method, which is the SMS OTP. And more precisely, with SMS OTP combined with a password. Indeed, an OTP received by SMS is an acceptable form of possession, and it materializes the possession of the phone, or rather of the SIM in the phone. But as we all know, this is not sufficient, as the strong customer authentication mandate requires a second form of authentication, which will be a knowledge or inherence factor. So let's say that the most logical way of completing the possession factor will be with a knowledge factor, in other words, a password. And so this is interesting because, as we know, a lot of payments, for example, on the internet, are secured by means of an OTP received by SMS. And this is no longer sufficient. Under PSD2, the authentication when paying will have to be materialized by an OTP plus a password. But the combination of both is an acceptable way of complying with the RTS, the regulatory technical standards on the strong customer authentication requirement. The RTS, as you probably know, also describe authentication codes, which should be generated as part of the authentication process. And more precisely, there is this mandate for dynamic linking for remote payments, for online payments, whereby this authentication codes would actually sign transaction information, including the transaction amount and the beneficiary or the payee. And so this method may comply with the RTS on these aspects, as the authentication code may be the OTP, and the OTP could be generated by actually digitally signing the amount and the payee, and therefore this could be a method of implementing fully the RTS. If we look now at the user journey, this is where this method presents some difficulties. So here I'm illustrating a user journey which starts on a merchant user interface or a third-party provider user interface. And so the user does stuff there and eventually has to authenticate. And so at that point, he will be redirected to a bank user interface and will be prompted to enter a password and the OTP that it will receive by SMS. And so the user has to grab their mobile phone, receive this OTP, copy this OTP in the user interface, enter the password, and eventually will be authenticated and redirected back to the TPP or merchant UI. And so you could have a similar journey on a mobile phone, but it does get worse because it means that you'll have to switch from one app to the SMS application and copy the SMS OTP back to the other. I mean, so it does become more complicated actually on mobile phones. But in general, especially for payment, this type of user journey does create some friction. And as you know, when paying online, any additional click is a chance to abandon the transaction. And so clearly this is not an ideal method. And so this is reflected in this pros and cons slide. The method does have advantages, by the way, and they're not insignificant. The main advantage of SMS OTPs is that they scale extremely well. The bank does not need to deploy any kind of software or user devices other than the mobile phone that people already have. And SMSs work on any mobile phone, so it does not have to be a specific smartphone. And so this is a very big advantage. Besides there is a very important notion that I'll be repeating throughout this presentation, which is account recovery in case the user have lost their device. Okay, possession factors materialized by a device. What happens if you lost your device? You can't authenticate anymore. You've lost access to the account and you need to recover. And this is, as we will see, a complicated subject. Well, one of the benefits from the banking perspective of SMS OTPs is that they're relatively easy to handle, because if you've lost your phone, you've not lost your phone number. So in other words, you will buy a new phone and you will ask your mobile phone operator to resend you a SIM card that you will insert in your phone, and your SIM card will generally match with your existing mobile phone number. You don't have to change your mobile phone number. And so from a bank perspective, they have actually nothing to do. The user buys a new phone, it's provisioned with a SIM with the same mobile phone number. The bank continues to send SMSs to that mobile phone number. And so from the bank's perspective, it is extremely simple to recover access to the account. By the way, the complexity is pushed to the mobile operator that needs to properly identify the user before sending a new SIM and so on and so forth. So the complexity remains, but at least it's not with the bank, it's with the mobile operator. And so strictly from a banking perspective, this is an advantage of this authentication method. Now, there are major disadvantages. We saw that the user experience is definitely not great, especially as the OTP is no longer enough. It has to be combined with a password. Because it has to be combined with a password, we're not resolving the password problem that Andrew described very well just before. And so we still have this complexity and these weaknesses linked to the use of passwords. And besides, as I believe you probably all know, the SMS channel is definitely not a secure channel and is prone to vulnerabilities, as have been documented numerous times. Finally, OTPs, as they're keyed into a user interface, are prone to phishing, because a user could be tricked into entering their OTP in a fake website, and the fraudster then using the OTP to access the genuine website. And so it is potentially a problem. This is another method which is frequently used in Europe, which makes use of specialized devices called OTP generators that sometimes accept a PIN. So they have a little keypad and the user enters a PIN on the device. Sometimes not, just a button that you press. And these devices generate an OTP. And the OTP has to be entered in the user interface of the bank, for example. So from a compliance perspective, if they do support PIN verification, then they fully comply with the requirements of the RTS, because the OTP materializes the device, or more precisely, the key that has been seeded in the device, and this will be a bank key that has been personalized in the device. And so the OTP materializes possession of this key. And the PIN code verified by the device will represent the knowledge factor. If the device is a simple device without PIN verification capability, then we're back to the previous case where the OTP has to be completed with an online password. But generally, a lot of these devices have PIN verification. And so they do comply fully with the RTS. And here again, the OTP that is generated may be the authentication code described in the RTS. And this authentication code could dynamically link or sign the amount of the transaction and the beneficiary. Now here, it's a bit tricky because if the device is as pictured here on this slide, it would mean that the user has to enter the amount manually and the payee identifier manually, which is extremely cumbersome. Now, we'll see now on the next slide on the user experience, some OTP generators actually have a little camera that can be used to scan a QR code. And so typically the bank user interface will present a QR code which contains the transaction details, the amount and the beneficiary, so that the dynamic linking is facilitated. So more generally, these are standalone devices. Some of them have a QR code scanning capability. So the user journey is a little bit like before. There is, of course, this redirection to the bank UI. You have to take your device, enter a PIN, generate the OTP, enter the OTP, and before being finally redirected back to the user interface of the TPP or of the merchant. And this user journey would be extremely similar if you're transacting on a mobile phone. Nevertheless, it is again a user experience with I'm still stuck on the same slide. If you could move on, please. Great. So here again, if we're looking at the advantages and disadvantages, so one of the main advantages of these specialized devices is that they're highly secure. They will typically contain a secure element that holds the key that is used to generate the OTP, and so they're very well secured. Another advantage is that these devices are issued by the bank to their users. And so from a user perspective, they have trust in these devices. Comparing to mobile phones, some people do not trust mobile phones and the security offered by mobile phones. And so this is an advantage of specialized devices. Now, the disadvantages, as we saw, are linked to the user experience. We just saw that there's multiple manipulations at the time of transaction, but also one of the major problems with these is that you need to have them where and when needed. And so if you're traveling and you need to buy something online, well, you have to have your device with you. If you want to access your account and you're at work, but you left it at home, you're stuck. And so this is a problem because you have to carry with them always, if I may say, at least if you don't want to have to access to your account when you're not anticipating to do so, and you don't have your device with you, that would be problematic. Again, as with any other solution that relies on a device, you have the issue of account recovery if you've lost your device. And so this would require the bank shipping a new device seeded with the proper key, and the user reactivating this device following some means of authentication or KYC. So anyway, so there is a reactivation process that needs to take place, which is part of the difficulties of account recovery. And again, as these solutions are based on OTPs, OTPs are phishable, as I already explained. You can move on. So this is another category of OTP generators, but that rely on the use of a payment card, EMV payment card, typically a smart card, which is inserted in these readers, and so they're called CAP readers, Chip Authentication Program. And so the devices themselves are not particularly personalized. They're very generic. They're meant to read the card, and the card is personalized with bank keys, and so that the card generates the actual OTP. Also, the card, as we all know, has the capability of verifying a PIN that can be keyed on a CAP reader and verified by the card itself. And so from a compliance perspective, here again, this solution perfectly complies with the RTS. The card is the possession factor, the PIN is the knowledge factor, the OTP may be the authentication code, and Here again, if this authentication needs to digitally sign a mountain payee, it could be done, but it's going to be, again, very cumbersome. The user experience is extremely similar to the one we just saw before. So typically CAP readers, I believe they don't really have QR code scanning capabilities. Some of them do have connectivity capabilities to the PC, certainly not to a mobile phone, however. And so whilst the user journey could be similar on a mobile phone, again, this dynamic linking aspect would be very problematic with CAP readers, as the user would normally have to key in the amount and some form of payee identification. So same story, it's several manipulations. And so overall, especially when paying, but not only, by the way, I mean, account aggregation, account aggregators have a lot of issues with PSD2 because an account aggregator offers services that allows a user to view its accounts in several banks. That's the whole purpose, you aggregate accounts from several banks. And so every time, albeit every 90 days, every time the user has to re-authenticate, it will have to grab 3 or 4 devices from the 3 or 4 banks and go through these procedures every time. So account aggregation can create actually these methods of authentication can create a lot of friction in account aggregation use cases, even for payment. Again, there's a lot of manipulation, which does create a lot of concerns to fintechs. Could move on. So the pros and cons here are quite similar, but actually a little bit different. One of the pros of this method is that the security and the actual possession device is the card. And let's say that usually people will have already, let's say the target population will already have this EMV payment card. The reader is very generic. It's not personalized at all. And so there could be multiple readers per customer. Actually, I have a colleague that uses this authentication method. He has one of these readers at home, and he has another reader in the office. Okay, I don't know if he carries it with him when he travels, but you can have with this kind of solutions several readers because the proper device is actually the payment card. And these cards are highly secure. They're very well trusted by the cardholders. But the cons, the problems are the same as before. The user experience is not great. The reader and the card must be available where and when needed, even though it may be a little bit simpler than with dedicated OTP generators. And we find again the same issues with account recovery. What happens if I've lost my reader or if I've lost my card? It requires shipping a new device, reactivating, so some form of user authentication before shipping the card and so on. So you find all these difficulties again with this kind of solution. Let's look now at more recent, let's say, solution which makes use of smartphones and biometric verification. And these tend to be proprietary solutions. And so most often these solutions are based on an application in a mobile wallet, if you will, in the phone that contains a bank key, which will be used in the authentication process. And so this bank key, typically these solutions are based on symmetric key cryptography, which means that the bank on the server side have a key which is provisioned into the mobile wallet of the mobile phone, and it's a shared secret. It's a symmetric key. And so these methods are based on a typical challenge response principle. And the bank server will send a challenge to the mobile wallet, which will be encrypted or signed by the mobile wallet using the bank key, and this will produce a signed response which is verified by the bank. And so typically these solutions will combine this method with some form of local user verification, be it a local PIN code, which is verified by the mobile wallet, or more frequently, the biometric modality supported by the mobile phone, which will be also verified locally. And so they, again, perfectly comply with the RTS. The bank key in the mobile phone is the possession factor. And the signed response will be the authentication code with dynamic linking. And so the user experience in these solutions is actually pretty good. You have here two examples, one where the user is transacting on a PC, and at the point of time when he has to authenticate, the user will receive a push notification on his mobile phone, prompting him to open the bank wallet and view the details and approve and authenticate at that stage. And this information is then transmitted and these type of solutions lend themselves very well to app-to-app use cases. When the user transacts on the mobile phone, they're switched to the mobile banking app of the bank for authentication purposes before being switched back to the TPP or to the merchant UI. So it's a good user experience. So the pros and cons: the pros, good user experience, support of biometrics, which contributes to the good user experience. And as the solution relies on mobile phones, let's say that often the user will carry the mobile phone with them when they go to the office, when they travel. It's not a device you leave at home, right? So it's typically a device that you have where and when needed, which makes it a very good tool for authentication purposes. Now, some of the disadvantages of these methods, as I said, many of them rely on symmetric key cryptography, which means that the bank key needs to be provisioned using a proprietary solution into the mobile phone. And this aspect of proprietary aspect also may create some scaling difficulties if the bank has to deploy alternative devices. And again, not everybody has an adequate smartphone, and not everybody wants to use a smartphone for such purposes. And therefore, a bank which has an obligation under PSD2 to reach all of its population will have to ship other devices, typically one of those other methods that we already have seen. And so you may get into some difficulties with proprietary solutions because they're not precisely standards. As usual, if you've lost your phone, you get into the account recovery difficulties, re-enrollment, reprovisioning of the key, and all that has to be preceded by some form of user authentication. So, but all these solutions have this problem. And so now let's look at FIDO and why does it make sense to change to FIDO? A quick reminder on FIDO, very briefly. Okay, FIDO is based on the possession of authenticators, which are devices that people have in order to authenticate. And these devices have the capability with FIDO to generate key pairs, a private key and a public key. FIDO is based on asymmetric cryptography, as we have seen just before. And one of the particulars of FIDO is that a FIDO authenticate generates the keys within the device. And at the time of enrollment, the public key component is sent to the bank and stored in the bank server. And the private key never leaves the device. That's the principle of FIDO registration. When people authenticate with FIDO, they have to start doing something on the device, typically entering a PIN code or at least touching the device or scanning a fingerprint or taking a selfie. So there's some form of biometric modality here again. And this unlocks the authenticator for the next step, which is the challenge response. Okay, so bank sends a challenge, it is signed by the private key in the device, and a signed response is provided back to the bank for verification. So a very simple method, very similar to the one we just saw, but now this is based on asymmetric cryptography and based on standards. From a compliance perspective, these solutions perfectly comply with the RTS as well. The private key materializes the possession of the device. The local PIN verification or the local biometric verification materialize the knowledge or inherence factor. Here again, the challenge may be combined with transaction details so that the signed response can be the authentication code with dynamic linking if this is for remote payments. So what are the advantages of FIDO authentication? From a user experience perspective, it is interesting to consider these two types of FIDO authenticators, what FIDO calls roaming authenticators and platform authenticators. Here we are looking at the user experience with a roaming authenticator. That is to say, a separate device from the one on which the user is interacting. So this user on a PC, his device may be a mobile phone, or it may be a USB key, for example. And so a roaming authenticator communicates either over the air in the case of a mobile phone, or locally via USB or Bluetooth or NFC. Okay? So in the upper example, it's a mobile phone. So at the time of authentication, as we have seen just before, it can either be an over-the-air push notification to the phone to open the bank wallet and authenticate, but actually FIDO supports local connections, and so it could be a BLE connection from the PC to the mobile phone in order to authenticate. In the lower example, the bank device is a USB key, okay, which in this case, for example, has a fingerprint verification, and so this the user inserts the key, touches the sensor, and authenticates in that manner. In the next slide, we look at FIDO platform authenticators. So Andrew talked about that very rapidly. More and more devices, be it PCs or mobile phones, now natively support a FIDO authenticator in some form of secure environment. For example, a TPM on a PC, could be on a secure element or a trusted execution environment on a mobile phone. And so here the user experience is even simpler because the transacting device is the authentication device. And so if you're on a PC, you're on the bank or merchant user interface, you're the TPP or your merchant user interface. At the time of authentication, you switch to the banking user interface, you put your fingerprint on the sensor, and you're done. Okay, same thing on the mobile phone. You switch from TPP UI to bank UI, you put your fingerprint or you take a selfie, and you're done. So it's extremely simple, very simple. Moving on. If we look now at the pros, so clearly the user experience, because it's a single gesture authentication, there's nothing to copy, there's nothing to remember, and you may even not need a separate device. Again, if as one can hope, there'll be more and more FIDO authenticators embedded in the transaction devices, be it PCs or mobile phones. You may not even need a separate device. So this is also a significant advantage of FIDO. As Andrew reminded us, FIDO authenticators are readily available in many platforms. Okay, the major operating systems of today, on mobile phones with Android, or even on desktop computers, actually you find Android as well, Windows 10, iOS, Mac OS, they all support FIDO. And moreover, the browsers, the major browsers, all support WebAuthn, the WebAuthn APIs, which are a component of FIDO2. And so this native support of FIDO in these devices, operating systems, and browsers are a great asset to scale. Interestingly, and it's linked to both the standardization aspect and this notion of key generation within the device, off-the-shelf device may be used. A bank does not need to deploy. You can buy a FIDO device on Amazon. Okay? You can buy your mobile phone and it has FIDO already supported. So a bank does not have necessarily to ship devices to their users because they may already have them. They may procure one, procure two if they wish, and so they're off-the-shelf devices, which is a major advantage. And here again, this notion of reachability may require a bank to support multiple form factors. And the standardization aspect of FIDO here is an asset to support FIDO devices, FIDO authenticators in different form factors, be it mobile or USB or smart card or whatever. You can even find mice for computers that support FIDO. Another advantage of FIDO is linked to security. With FIDO, there's no shared secrets, and so there's nothing to hack. It's a major advantage. I mean, there's no need to breach databases to get passwords. There's none. There's no secret key. It's public keys, and you can't do anything with the public key. So nothing, no shared secrets, nothing to hack. Also, FIDO is built with anti-phishing mechanisms. So a lot of problems with passwords is man in the middle and phishing attacks. FIDO has a built-in feature to prevent this from happening. I'm not going to go through the details, but it's based on the fact that the authenticator can actually sign the web origin of the bank server, and so the verification of the signed response proves to the bank that nobody was in the middle playing and messing things around. Now, FIDO does have a disadvantage, as with all these other methods, which is account recovery. It is clearly a problem. FIDO has spent quite a bit of time trying to find a good solution to manage account recovery. FIDO proposes two methods to do so, because one of the key aspects that FIDO tries to prevent is introducing a weak link through the account recovery procedure. For example, if the account recovery requires to authenticate the user with a password and an OTP by SMS, then you're introducing a weakness. There's no point doing FIDO if you can actually have this alternative authentication method because you lost your device. And so to prevent this from happening, FIDO proposes two methods that are stronger. Okay, the first one is actually for the user to enroll two authenticators, the main one and a backup one, and this is facilitated by the fact that these devices do not need to be shipped by the bank, they're off the shelf. So a user could enroll their PC if it has an embedded authenticator and their mobile phone, or it could enroll their mobile phone and a USB key that they keep as backup. So there are various methods to enroll several authenticators so that the backup one can be used for backup, but also to re-register the new one. If not so, then FIDO proposes that the full KYC step that was done to identify initially this user when it opened an account is reused to re-register a new authenticator. So this brings us to the end. This is a short recap that you can see in the white paper of a quick comparison of these, in a very simplified view, of course, of how FIDO compares to alternative methods. FIDO clearly has an advantage in terms of user convenience. If you can move actually to the final slide, Megan. The advantages of FIDO and why as a bank you may want to change to FIDO is because of the enhanced user experience. It's very simple. Also because there are intrinsic security and phishing resistance features in FIDO, and because for all the reasons I explained, FIDO will scale very well. And so this brings us to the end. We do have some time for questions. We'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, Alan, thank you very much. As Alan mentioned, now is the time for Q&A. So the way we work this is if you would please type your questions into the GoToWebinar client. We'll do our best to address as many as possible in the remaining 9 minutes of this call. Anything else, we'll try to follow up by email. We already have some in the queue. Alan, I'm going to start by asking you to kind of reiterate how OTPs can be phished. There's a string of questions here. Doesn't TOTP solve it by SMS by the code being generated locally? OTP is only useful for 20 seconds. A string of questions around that. Briefly, how can OTPs be phished?
Well, OTPs can be phished because they can be entered in a fake website, and the fraudster that then has access to this OTP can use it to access the genuine website. Now, if the OTP has only a validity of 20 seconds, for sure, that will be difficult. However, if the OTP has only a validity of 20 seconds, it makes also the life difficult for the user because they really have to hurry up. And so I don't exactly know how long an OTP lasts, but it lasts enough. It has to be long enough for the usability. Okay, if the user has to copy the OTP, it needs a little bit of time to do so. And so a fraudster could access the OTP in that period of time in order to access the account. Okay, maybe it is theoretical, but it is possible.
Yes, and I'd also, and these programmatic relay attacks that are out there that are spun up with software that hackers can use, to do it seamlessly. Right. So if there's a man-in-the-middle attack, relay attack, the OTP code is sent to the fake site. It's automatically sent to the real site, so that the bad actor actually can complete the account takeover. One question I'm going to clarify real quick. For FIDO authenticators, platform roaming, a PIN is perfectly fine, correct? Yes, it is. So the core thing that FIDO does is allow you to authenticate locally. So you can use a PIN. In fact, I'm aware of some implementations in emerging markets, actually I think it's in India, where, as the devices are not as complex to fully support suitable biometrics, that people are authenticating themselves with a PIN. So PIN is a local authentication method, as is biometric, rather than being dependent on anything on the server. Alan, another question for you. A lot of what we're doing inside the FIDO Europe Working Group is engaging with EU regulators and related bodies. The question is, what are EU regulators thinking about FIDO? So maybe you could talk a little bit about the engagements we've had, the feedback we've seen so far from the EBA and other groups.
The regulator is fine with FIDO, but they don't take. They're not going to promote one method versus another. That would be stepping out of their role. So we've met with, indeed, the European Commission, with DG FISMA, with a bunch of regulators, and they're happy with FIDO. But they're not. I don't think they will take that step to promote FIDO. That would be not their role. So yes, we've met regulators. And yes, they're happy with FIDO, but again, they look at compliance, right? And so FIDO complies, so they're happy. So they're not taking sides. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think that's good. The point is they're not taking sides, but they're aware of FIDO and we've had positive feedback in the discussions we've had with them. Alan, can you describe how a FIDO authenticator might be used to meet the dynamic linking requirement for an FCA flow?
To meet the dynamic linking requirement, right? That was the question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. So as I explained very briefly, as FIDO Authenticator signs a challenge message. If the challenge message is built with the transaction details, and typically the amount and beneficiary, then the signature produced is an authentication code with dynamic linking. It actually signs, which is the requirement, it actually signs the transaction details.
Okay. Here's a question, how do we ask our banks and payment providers to use FIDO? That's a good question. one thing that FIDO's done recently, we've initiated a consumer brand effort, consumer education effort. So we have a website, loginwithfido.com, which is meant to start generating consumer awareness and ideally some pull on service providers to use FIDO. Additionally, it's set up such that banks and payment networks that use FIDO can point their customers to these sites to help answer any questions they might have about FIDO. So the short answer there is, you can ask your bank to use FIDO. We're aware of many that are planning, both banks and merchants who are planning their FIDO implementations. And we do think this will start coming to many more consumers in Europe and around the globe in the months to come. Just kind of skimming through these. Okay, Alan, when using FIDO, I assume the issuer holds the public key for the payment. How does that work with the merchant? So how does the merchant interact with the issuer in a FIDO authentication flow?
So as illustrated in the different user experience I showed during the presentation, in each of them, there is a redirection from the merchant site or merchant user interface to a bank user interface. And within the bank user interface, the user authenticates. And so the bank has the public key because there was a registration phase during which the key pair was generated and the public key uploaded to the bank server. And so from the merchant perspective, the merchant has nothing to do. Now, behind the question, I suspect there is this notion that it would be better if there is no redirection to the bank user interface. And so we get here into alternative authentication models. For example, authentication delegation, which is a subject that FIDO has looked at and is still looking at, where the merchant authenticates the user. And so the merchant would be using FIDO, the merchant would have a FIDO server, and the merchant would have the users register with them. And so the users authenticate with the merchant, which simplifies the user experience because there's no redirection. Now, under PSD2, and more specifically looking at the EBA opinions, the bank should authenticate the user, but the bank may delegate authentication to another party, provided this is governed by some form of contractual relationship. So that's where we get into difficulties with the delegated model, is that there should be some form of contractual relationship between the merchant and the bank, which does not scale unless there is a framework agreement. And so some of the card schemes, for example, have created framework agreements so that a merchant only signs with the scheme and a bank only signs with the scheme, which allows multiple merchants to benefit from delegation. Okay, so these programs exist for certain schemes, so not all, but for certain schemes, there is a delegation program. And this would be a way of simplifying the user journey in that respect. I don't know if that answers the question properly.
I believe so. I had a question earlier, just to wrap up. We know which banks already support FIDO, and someone else asked a question. I have a BBVA app. I'm placing my finger on this. This is using FIDO authentication. As I mentioned, many banks are working on their implementations. Specific to BBVA, we did see an announcement earlier this year. BBVA is partnering with one of our founding vendors, Knock Knock Labs, to bring FIDO to BBVA customers. I don't know if that's live or not, but that's a good example of how you're seeing many banks actually start to bring FIDO to users. We maintain an active list of case studies on our website, at FIDOalliance.org. We anticipate more case studies in the future. So this is my cue here based on this slide to wrap up. So Alan, first of all, thank you very much for your time today and leading this discussion. Thank all of you. Thanks to everyone who joined as well. If we didn't have time to answer your question, please reach out to us at help@FIDOalliance.org. Last but not least, two things. One, we'll send you the slides, yes. And secondly, please take a couple moments to fill out the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. We greatly value your feedback in shaping this webinar series moving forward. So with that, let's wrap up. Thank you. I hope you all have a very nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.